Goeiedag and welcome. My name is Amarenske and this is episode 6 of my series Neurons. This episode I will be talking about the neurodevelopment of the embryo, so the embryological development of the brain. And I say, let's get started with gastriculation, which is the phase of the embryological development of the brain, or more just regular development that takes place in the third week of development. In this phase, the three embryonic germ layers are formed, which are the endoderm, which is the precursor to the gut and its derivatives, including the lungs, the ectoderm, which is the precursor to the central nervous system, skin, hair, and more. But most of all, things that include direct contact with the outside world, and the mesoderm, which is a precursor of blood vessels, bones, and connective tissues, among some other things. Those layers are formed. Gas circulation starts with the formation of the primitive streak at day 15 to 16. When a clear groove is visible, the cells on the sides start to migrate inward, which is called invagination, and some of those invaginated cells displace and thus form the three germ layers. Through the cephalic end of the primitive streak, so the top end where in the end the head will be, the prenotochordal cells invaginate the formating tube, because those folds will turn into a tube. These cells will then form the notochordal plate and later the notochord, which is a structure that underlies the neural tube and is the basis for the axial skeleton, which includes the vertebral column, ribs, sternum, and skull. So the axial skeleton is the part of the skeleton that protects the central nervous system, plus the ribs and the sternum. For the person who doesn't know what the sternum is, it's the midline part between the two sides of the rib cage. Between the 3rd and 8th week of the development, which is called the embryonic period, I already mentioned that gastriculation takes place, and the three germ layers are formed that give rise to a number of specific tissues and organs, which is important for the development. At the end of the 8th week, so approximately 2 months into development, every structure that the human body needs is already present, and the basic form of the human body is recognizable. But for the sake of keeping this video not so long as like hours and hours, I will only focus on the nervous system here, how it develops, and even more specifically parts of the central nervous system, because this stuff is long and it might get boring if the video gets too long or just simply too complex. But at the beginning of the 3rd week of development, like I said before, the ectodermal germ layer that now has the form of disc starts to develop, and the appearance of the notochord and precaudal mesoderm induce the formation of the neural plate in it. In the overlying ectoderm, this induction of cells is called neurulation. It's the start of the formation of the central nervous system, basically what neurulation is. Or more specifically, neurulation is the process of forming the neural tube from the neural plate, as depicted in the picture that is now shown on screen. The lateral edges rise and create the formation of a depressed region in the middle between them, which is called the neural groove. The elevated regions are called neural folds, and at the end they fuse together on top, but they fuse together and then they form the neural tube. The two ends close at, so the end which would form the head region and the head end that would form like the region near the butt, they close at different times of the development, about 3 days apart. The cranial or head region neuropore, the open parts of the tube are called neuropores, closes around day 25 of development, whereas the posterior or like butt end for one closes around day 28. If something goes wrong during the closure of those pores or they don't close properly, you can get spina bivida, or which is what we call in Dutch an open ruggetje, where the back, including the skin on the back, is not properly closed and part of the nervous system is damaged because the nerves cannot stand all the fluids that the embryo lies in. But if this happens on the top, like around the head, the baby gets a condition called anencephaly, which basically is like an improperly or almost completely undeveloped brain. It will not be a surprise. Those people cannot live. They get born and they either are stillborn or die directly after birth because they cannot sustain their own body. But at day 28, neurulation is complete and the central nervous system can start further developing further, because this is only the basis. A difference between the ends can already be seen because the caudal portion is smaller and will form the spinal cord, whereas the cephalic or the brain region version is wider and contains brain vesicles, which will later develop into the brain. But as of a short summary now, because I have mentioned the germ layers multiple times, specifically ectoderm, because that is the part that uses the cells to form the nervous system, amongst other things, and I will give a summary about what develops from the ectoderm specifically. The central nervous system, as well as the peripheral nervous system, which consists of cranial nerves, which are sensory nerves basically, and some motor nerves as well that directly spring from the brain and go to organs like the eyes, the mouth, the facial muscles, that kind of stuff. They don't go via the spinal cord, which is relatively regular with motor and sensory neurons, but these ones don't. It also includes the formation of sensory epithelial, so cell layers, of the eyes, ears and nose, and the top layer of the skin, including hair and nails. But also something that might be a little bit less obvious if you are talking about stuff that is in direct contact with the outside world. Subcutaneous glands, which are glands directly under or not directly visible in the skin. I envision stuff like sweat glands and some excreted hormones, mammary glands, the pituitary gland, and the enamel of the teeth. So this was all about germ layers and the first 2-ish months of development specifically, but now I will focus a little bit on the central nervous system and start talking about the schematic view of the start of brain development, in which we have the 3 parts of the brain, which is the hindbrain, the midbrain and the forebrain. And it develops more. The brain develops with sort of a focus on sensory neurons. We have 2 names for what I can focus on, and I will not really go in depth about those because it's not really very important. But the brain has, like I said, sort of a focus on sensory neurons, which, if you consider that the brain processes sensory impulses from the outside world, is not such a strange thing. But the spinal cord and the brain stem have on both parallel sides motor and sensory neurons hanging around, because they, especially around the brainstem, those things need to be either put together in packages of information, or you have the transition to movements and stuff. And if we're talking about the development of the cerebral hemispheres, or where they develop from, which is the telencephalon, that starts at the beginning of the 5th week of development. The rapidly growing bulges, like I said, there are several brain vesicles, and 2 of those develop into the hemispheres of the brain, and they push into certain other structures that have been formed before, like the foramen of Monroe. And they form the other structures like the corpus striatum, which is a structure that is called in short striatum because it has a very striped look to it, but it's also the part of the brain that filters impulses, and that is differently developed in people with, for example, autism and ADHD, in the way that it does filter impulses and stuff differently as compared to a regular person, which in turn causes at least part of the symptoms that people with a neurodevelopmental disorder have. But like, there are more brain regions that play a role. But after that period that happens, like the brain hemispheres continue to grow, and the folded look that appears later because the brain becomes so big it cannot stay smooth. There is just no space in the skull for that. But basically this is all I wanted to tell for now. I guess the abrupt ending fits with my autism, and I would say thank you for watching and tot de keer!